We are to keep the Lord's Day holy, and we do this most properly through our worship of God on Sunday at Holy Mass. But this is so much more than just going to Mass. It is truly an opportunity to be drawn into the life of God, to be drawn towards the eternal Sunday of heaven. Let's take a look at this commandment from the point of view of how our Sunday worship is truly the most proper fulfilling of this most beautiful commandment. The third commandment is to remember to keep holy the Lord's Day. Now, this formulation is different from the original, which is found in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. There, the people are exhorted through Moses to keep holy the Sabbath, reminded as they were of God's work of creating and how in 6 days he carried out all his work and rested on the seventh. So too, God's holy people were to carry out their work over the first 6 days of the week and to rest on the seventh or Sabbath day. And when we consider this commandment, it is important for us to recognize that the implications for us as Christians believing in Jesus Christ, crucified, died, and risen from the dead, that the reality of keeping the Lord's Day is centered upon not the creation of this world, but upon a new creation, a creation that Jesus Christ ushered in through his Paschal mystery, which will never pass away. And it is here that we can enter into the deeper meaning of this commandment, that to keep the Lord's Day is to keep that day upon which our Lord Jesus Christ fully accomplished our salvation, being raised up from the dead, so that death would no longer have power over him or over any of us who receive baptism in his name. And so we keep not the seventh day, but quite truly the 8th day. And in the scriptures, we know from the testimonies of Jesus' resurrection that it was early in the morning on the first day of the week that they went out to the tomb and witnessed that Jesus was not in the tomb, but had been raised up, whether by the voice of the angel or we have Jesus himself speaking to Mary Magdalene, revealing to her that it is he, and that she, for her part, is to go to the others and tell them that he has been raised and they will see him in Galilee. And so when we consider our own keeping of this commandment, the shift from the 7th day to this first day of the week, the day that Jesus was raised up from the dead, is at the very heart of why we would call it the Lord's Day, that we are speaking of that day in which salvation is revealed in the risen Christ. And so practically, what does this mean for us? For one, it means that we keep not Saturday, the 7th day, but Sunday, the day that Jesus was raised from the dead. And as already mentioned, there is this very beautiful implication of the 8th day. Think of it as the first week was the creation of this world, and now in the second week, or on this 8th day, God ushers in a new creation, ushering in what is eternal, what will not pass away. And this beautiful imagery has been in the church from its earliest times. When we look at those who were first century apologists, such as St. Justin Martyr, though of course he's more early 2nd century, but certainly he would have been alive in the 1st century. People like Ignatius of Antioch. The reality of keeping Sunday is present in their writings. And the fact that this is how Christians truly are to assemble. Why? Because it is on this day that Jesus was raised. And so it is that even from the earliest times, Sunday became that day of true worship, true rest in the Lord. And we want to recognize here what this rest really means. Because for some, it might seem confusing that, well, why would we worship if we're supposed to rest on Sunday? In fact, I find it quite beautiful, the innocence of children, when they've asked me, Father, if we're not supposed to work on Sunday, how come you have to work? And it's a good question, because it shows that they recognize that the Mass does require effort. It does require a level of work. But here is a beautiful teaching on this reality, and one that we will dive into much more fully when we begin treating the sacraments. And that is the reality that the work that is done on this Lord's Day, it's not our work to do for God. It's the work of God accomplished on our behalf, and we are called to partake of it, to benefit from it, to receive the saving graces that the Lord offers to us through it. And so it is, our keeping of the Lord's Day is one that, yes, requires worship of us, but not worship as though it is a work of ours. It is truly the work of God, carried out on our behalf. And to that end, too, might we consider this reality of the Sunday obligation then. Oftentimes people get caught up in thinking of it on a very basic level, not incorrectly, but it tends to stay at this basic level of, well, we have to go to church. And that's how it is. That's what it means to be Catholic, is we go to Mass on Sundays. And that's where it begins, and that's honestly for some where it ends. But in truth, it's much more beautiful than simply us fulfilling an obligation. We want to think of it as the early church always thought of it and has been handed down to us. That it is, yes, as already alluded to, a entering into the Lord's resurrection, a celebrating of what Jesus accomplished. And this is why the Eucharist is so significant as the Easter sacrament. Yes, Jesus gave it to us on Holy Thursday at the Last Supper, prior to his being taken up in the passion and death. But he, for his part, gave this sacrament fully aware, of course, of what he would be accomplishing. And he gave it as a means for us to receive his true living presence, his body, blood, soul, and divinity, that yes, was crucified, and yes, was raised from the dead, that we are able to partake of the fullness of his saving works. And so our partaking of the Mass on Sunday in a real way celebrates the whole of the Easter mystery, but in a special way his resurrection, because what we receive is his divine life, that which will never die again, that which you and I are called to partake of forever in the kingdom of heaven. And in this way, when we partake rightly of the Eucharist, we are receiving a foretaste of what is to come. First and foremost on the level of, yes, having that divine life within us, but think about the reality of the Mass as our worship. What is heaven going to be? Heaven is going to be the eternal worship of God. And don't worry about this, because people might hear that and say, oh, if heaven's going to be the eternal worship of God, I don't know if I want to go there, because worship's so boring, and I would rather be out fishing if it was truly a heavenly experience, or be carrying out my other favorite hobby, or be with my family. But time out here. The reality is that when we talk about eternal worship of God, we're talking about perfect love for God, perfect love for all who are in God. And in this way, the Mass is also a foretaste. And perhaps you've noticed this in your own experience, how our partaking of the worship of the Mass tends to lend itself to a want to be with those with whom we worship. Maybe you've noticed this through the years. It's one of the beautiful elements of many Catholic parishes, how the communal way of life that is shared in so many parishes is carried out then by extending that community beyond the worship to a time of restful sharing fellowship with one another, let's say, after Mass. It's a beautiful thing here at St. Benedict Parish. How many people like to be with one another and converse after Mass in the gathering space, and they will be there for a lengthy amount of time, as though this is the only reality, to be with those with whom they share a common faith in Jesus Christ. It's a beautiful testimony to the power of our Sunday worship, the power of what Jesus Christ accomplishes in the Eucharist. To recognize that our partaking then in the Eucharist, it's not merely just to do our obligation, though that piece is written into our recognition of why we are called to worship on Sunday. No, our call is to be drawn in to a sharing in the life of God, His Holy Communion in the Trinity, and we receive this by way of a foretaste in the Eucharist itself, but also in a visible way by the communion of all who rightly partake. And this is, after all, why we call our sharing in the Eucharist Holy Communion, because it is an entrance into that life, that union with God, with all who are in God, in a very visible way, but still but by a foretaste. We are not in heaven yet. This is but the beginning or the inkling of what is to come. And so to recognize that as we keep this commandment, this is why the Sunday Mass is so important, at least on one level. We want to recognize, too, that our keeping holy of the Lord's Day is also a right way to celebrate and enter more deeply into what our Lord Jesus accomplished from the point of view of that which happened one time in history, Jesus taking on our human flesh, offering himself up in death, and being raised from the dead. These mysteries are made present to us again, not as though Jesus has to undergo death multiple times. He has undergone death once, but the fruits of what he has undergone are made present to us again at each and every Holy Mass, whether on Sunday or any day of the week. And so to realize that our Sunday worship renews and truly increases within us our share in the covenant. And therefore, it is why keeping the Lord's Day as a partaking of the worship of Sunday Mass is at the very heart of our being, why it is the source and summit of the Christian life. Finally, and very briefly, I'm going to put a link with this video to a document from St. John Paul II, his apostolic letter Dies Domini, on the Lord's Day. It's a very beautiful document, and as things go with St. John Paul II, this document is very, very accessible, easy to read, and chock full of beautiful imagery of many of these things I myself have tried to articulate here in this short video. And so I invite you to go on the Vatican website link that I will post and to download this beautiful document and take a look at it as a means of recognizing both the power of our worship on Sunday, but then also some of the other implications of what true rest in God really means, and how we are called to rest on this day, not just from our labors, but to rest so as to share in the foretaste of heaven, so as to receive renewal for this life, so as to carry on in the rest of our week, knowing that Jesus Christ dwells within us and is calling us back to be drawn into ever deeper communion each and every Sunday. May God bless you.